All right, I am really pleased to be able to introduce one of our fellows. Lisa Scheer is the professor of strategic business-to-business management at the University of Graz in Austria. And she retired as the Emma S. Hibbs Distinguished Professor at the University of Missouri. She got her PhD. Always fans here, right? She earned her PhD in marketing at Northwestern and her BSBA and MBA at the University of Missouri. She has been immersed in business markets since growing up in a small family-owned common carrier trucking company, which I now need to know more about. This background
transfer company.
Yeah, okay. This background helps motivate her academically rigorous and managerial relevant research on business markets, marketing strategy, and marketing relationships, which has resulted in publications in top-level journals and various research awards. She has been, of course, honored as our fellow and an AMA fellow, and she has been directing the research camp, which is why we haven't seen her much this week. Everybody benefited highly, as I understand. She has developed or chaired a variety of academic meetings, and she's been keynote speaker all around the world, where I'm really delighted to hear more about this particular topic. And we ended the conversation of the last one talking about how the human element just can't be lost in this process of automation and AI. So let's hear what you want, Lisa. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to speak with you. I preface every one of my talks with a little disclaimer. I had a very serious illness some years ago, and occasionally, because of that, there's some damages I just live with. So don't be surprised if I may go sit down a couple times during the presentation. And if I seem a little out of breath, don't worry about it. The only time to be nervous is if I actually hit the floor.
You're the only one.
Practice on that. We jumped over together.
I always take a good example.
Senior leaders at the ISBM have very special training.
Well, so far that hasn't happened, but I have had to take a little break and sit down for a minute now and then, so that may happen. So yeah, I've been really, my whole career has essentially focused on behavioral aspects, but within B2B and within strategy development and such. And so we got to thinking about 10 years ago, is that going to continue to be the case with the trends and the way things were going? So we engaged in a variety of research projects to try to examine that issue. And so what I'm going to be sharing with you today are some of the findings of that research. And I think it's very solid research. It doesn't mean it applies in every context, of course, but I think it applies in many contexts. So let me just start. This is going to be an interactive session. Are your customers loyal? Who says yes? Who thinks their customers are loyal? Yeah, some. Okay, some of the indicators that people use for loyalty: repeat sales, high share of wallet, good net promoter score. How many of you track your net promoter score? Ugh. The net promoter score is awful, guys. I got a whole nother presentation on that for a different issue, but regardless, still good net promoter score, other good loyalty indicators. So you're like, yes, our customers are loyal. What don't you know? Why? Assuming you're right, that they are loyal, why? So I think we always need to stop and go beneath that initial loyalty assessment. To loyal to what? Or loyal to whom? So that's what this first little piece of research I'm going to share with you focuses on. Now, I want to emphasize we had actual sales data, and we had surveys of both manufacturers' reps, the sellers, and the customers. So we had matched dyadic surveys from both sides of the transaction, as well as actual sales. And that's what this is based on. So we examined loyalty to the firm. We used this measure, which is the most typical At that point, I think the most frequently used measure in academia for loyalty to the firm. I will consider this rep firm my first choice. I plan to buy from this rep firm. I would recommend, I encourage. Again, it's not why. Why will I do all those things? And why is at least as important, if not more important than just what. So that's what this study focused on. We had the opinion that much of what appears to be loyalty to the firm actually isn't owned, so to speak, by the firm. Now think, if you were filling out a survey like this and you're the customer, you don't sit there and disentangle patents and assets that are owned by the firm or the quality of the products owned by the firm and only focus on those things. You're focusing on your whole interface, your whole interaction, the whole bundle of benefits and services you get from the firm, many of which are vested in interpersonal elements. Now, we didn't try to study all of the panoply of interpersonal elements there could be, but because of this context with the rep firm, it was mainly one primary interpersonal contact. So that's what we focused on in this context. But I think it's a broader issue of all those different points of contact. So we also then measured, which there was no measure for, salesperson owned loyalty. So we developed a measure of salesperson owned loyalty. Why? Because previous ways academics had measured salesperson loyalty did the very same problem that the firm loyalty scale did. They allowed the commingling of both. Am I going to totally disentangle the salesperson from the things the salesperson is selling, those proprietary assets? Not unless you specifically somehow make me do that. And the previous measures of salesperson loyalty did not do that. So we developed one, projective, admittedly, but still trying to disentangle the loyalty that was vested or owned by the salesperson versus the loyalty that was beyond the salesperson to the firm. So this is the list that we developed. What if the salesperson moved to a new firm? How likely would you be? Would you do less business if the salesperson changed? Now, it could be retirement. It could be moving to a new firm. We didn't want to disentangle those. We just wanted to try to get how much is vested in the person. So here's what we found. Greater salesperson loyalty had a huge set of benefits. The customers reported greater willingness to pay a premium. The salespersons reported greater selling effectiveness, so their perception of how effective they were being, and most importantly, greater objective sales growth. Also, as would be expected, it impacted loyalty to the firm. Now, what really surprised the sample of rep firms we were working with was the next slide, which is, well, what if we kind of already account for salesperson owned loyalty? How much is left? There, what we found, salesperson owned loyalty is already accounted for. Loyalty to the firm had no impact on sales growth in this environment. Again, I'm not saying this would be true for every firm. You did have a positive effect on the customer reported variable, which honestly is the shakiest of the three outcome variables. So our point here isn't, oh, the firm will never have a direct impact on sales growth. That's not our point. Our point is, though, unless you disentangle the part of loyalty that is vested in your interpersonal contacts, you can easily overestimate how much of the loyalty is actually tied to firm-owned elements versus the interpersonal. So the more important the interpersonal contact is to you, you could be way overestimating that what appears to be loyalty to the firm could largely be salesperson-owned loyalty. And when I presented this to a bunch of accountants and auditors, they were like, oh yeah, we know this, but we don't know how much. I'm like, well, there's a way to know how much. Actually, seek it out, understand it. Then you might know which ones are more important to hold on to and which ones aren't. Yes,
This makes complete sense, Lisa, because in the B2B world, this is why people in the old days, salespeople would move to another organization. In the old days, we call it the Rolodex, and take
their customers with them.
Because the loyalty was to the person they had been working with.
And that's why there's such an emphasis on these overall loyalty and net promoter score. I mean, I've consulted where that's all they wanted to know. It's how's our net promoter score changing from year to year? And I would want to just like tear my hair out. I'm like,
Yeah, like another common problem is my net promoter score sucks. What do I do now? You got one number. Good luck with that. Draw a line.
No, I may be jumping ahead, but we all know that the relationship after COVID and even during COVID has changed with the field salesperson being pulled back. And now this statistic that I hate, which is that the client does most of their research and online. Now, so the question becomes, have you done a survey like this under the new
yes.
environment?
No, but I have some data from another study right about the time it happened that will, I think, address part of what you're doing.
Good.
But again, I'm not saying this is always static or it always stays the same, but simply that you don't want to assume some of these broad loyalty measures are actually an indicator of how much loyalty is to your firm. It's good to know how much may be vested in some of the key interpersonal contacts.
Again, this might be jumping ahead. Is it possible that some of the loyalty to the firm is loyalty to their product?
Yes, absolutely.
Can that be separated out?
Here, I think that kind of what you really need to do is sort of develop, like we did, salesperson loyalty, for your own context, a measure of selling firm owned loyalty, to really assess those aspects and assets that are truly permanently with your firm, at least, in the short term, not vested in interpersonal. We couldn't do that here because for us to publish academically, we had to measure firm loyalty the way it's always been measured. Because if we didn't do that and we get an effect, they'll say, well, you wouldn't have gotten that fact if you'd actually used the measure everybody uses. So we had no choice. We actually had to do it this way. But yes, if I'm in a firm, I would want to try to do something similar in your context with salesperson owned or service person owned, whatever the primary, most important interpersonal contacts are, assess that, and then develop a firm specific measure to assess those elements that you actually control and own and can't leave your firm. And that way you measure those two things. And I think you have a much better understanding of the composition of some overall loyalty measure that you may still want to take, but then you know more what is the configuration of it. It could be from just a sliver to no interpersonal loyalty, or it could be a huge percentage is interpersonal loyalty. If you don't measure it, you don't know for sure. So that's really the message. So for example, where might this be particularly important? In professional services, where there's a very important rep or service provider role, maybe setting specifications where that interaction is quite important. Renewal decisions, perhaps. Am I being handled and treated well? So we don't want to even look elsewhere, and so on. So kind of moving toward one of the questions here, as technology advances, some argue that interpersonal relationships are becoming less important. And in some ways, I think that is definitely true. But the question is that universal, or under what circumstances is this more likely to happen? So we engaged in this study where, obviously I'll let the punchline go, interpersonal still matters, but we had 3,600 plus customers of a global industrial seller. This is a Fortune 500 company, Fortune 50 maybe, very big company. And our basic question we were wanting to gain insight on was, are salespeople less essential to customers who engage heavily in online activities? So while it's not directly on target, but it was, these are kind of those leading edge customers who were doing a lot of their, spending a lot of time with their online catalogs. So they were doing search, a lot of search online rather than asking their salesperson. They also did a lot of purchasing online. So the basic argument that was being promoted at that point in time was, well, if your customers are searching info online and purchasing online, why do you want to devote salesperson resources to that customer, reallocate them somewhere else? We didn't buy that. And so that's why we wanted to ask this question and see what we found. So very interestingly, among customers that predominantly purchase online, the seller derived about twice as much net profit. Again, we had actual profit from those that had greater contact. And this is with an inside salesperson. One might imagine that could even be greater with face-to-face contacts, perhaps, but this was inside salesperson. So it was sort of kind of what happened after COVID, right?
Just, I hate to interrupt this way, but a quick story. When at IBM, we went to a hybrid model, which was the external salespeople were teamed with an internal
Yes.
salesperson.
Yeah.
In covering the territory. And so it was a direct team relationship.
Mhm.
The customer satisfaction scores went up on the basis that the customers could find the answer to their problem faster than trying to get the outside salesperson who was always traveling and not available. And so that hybrid model actually dramatically increased customer satisfaction,
Yeah,
even though they saw less of the face-to-face person.
that doesn't surprise me at all. But then the question is, so is the face-to-face person needed at all? I don't know, but the interpersonal contact though, with the inside sale, and this was an inside sales force, so I was even more dubious about, we're making it harder, I think, to find an effect by looking at the inside sales force versus their outside sales force. But quite honestly, there were a lot more of them, so we had a bigger sample and a bigger, for academic purposes, so that's why we looked there.
It's pretty emphatic, 2x.
Yes, the company we were working with was shocked. They did not realize that, because they were very seriously contemplating reallocating resources, and they're like, wait a minute. Now, I want to emphasize, this is a whole range of customer sizes. As you can see, with 3,000 whatever customers, it was actually a stratified sample of their 5 categories based on size, so we had a stratified sample across all these sizes. We didn't see any real size effect here, except the very largest companies are the ones that are buying and purchasing the most, so they were a little overrepresented actually in these groups. But they were like, oh my God, they're doing what? Because they were very seriously going to reallocate some of these salespeople. So we had an intuition this would happen. And this is why. Now, we did not test this, but when we kind of talked to folks afterwards, we kind of got verification for what we were thinking. You don't want your salesperson wasting their time with routine repurchase orders and that kind of crap. Instead, route those people online for repeat purchases and free up that customer interaction time with your inside or outside salespeople for relationship building, product introduction, learning more about the customer's needs, et cetera, et cetera. And that's why we expected to see that it would be better. We didn't expect to see it would be 2x. We were mainly that it wouldn't be, reasonable to reality. Wow, did we find more than we expected in that regard? Yes.
Quick question. That brings up so many thoughts. That makes obvious sense. Do you think that there's a psychological aspect in B2B sales that when you're making a decision purchase, and not the repurchase of something you've done before the routine, but the decision-making process, that there's a feeling you don't want to go it alone and you have a shared responsibility in that decision-making, and that's why there's more of a trust or a wantingness of the buyer to have a salesperson?
I think it could be when you already have an ongoing relationship, yes, that can play a role in as well, absolutely. The big issue, which I'm going to actually get to in one of my later studies, is what happens if you don't have that prior
Okay, yeah.
relationship? And we'll also go there in a minute. So, what are the implications? Well, we argued there's various ways you can think about this. Online and salesperson channels are complementary. It's not like just because one happens to be actively used doesn't mean the other one should necessarily be abandoned. There's different types of communications and different modes of communication and ways to interact and content through those different channels. So they're complementary if you use them correctly. And especially here for the heavy online user, we saw even more of an impact. So we would say design your online interface with easy access to get to the salesperson, hot buttons, whatever, direct chat, some way. So if they're looking at something online, they easily could get in touch with that personal element if they want to get, but don't make me have to like type it in. But some make it as easy and seamless as possible to move between the two modes.
I'm sorry, have you validated this with other large industrial sellers?
We only did it in this particular one. And again, I can't say for sure it would generalize, but this industrial seller is very typical. They, by the way, have, that was actually for the last study as well. It's a wholesaler. So they don't have a lot of proprietary elements. So it's important for them to repeat and keep the customers and so forth, because they don't have the patented products that will hold them. And that's why I don't argue our results are going to be exact. But I think
Sure.
there's insights that we could take here that would generalize to other settings. And something to think about and maybe examine in your own settings. And a lot of folks were sort of like, the salespeople don't really want to let go of that order taking process. But if you can show them by collaborating and integrating the online purchasing and freeing their time up for these building efforts, they actually benefit as well. Now, this may need to be considered in your compensation systems, right? How you get compensated if you've started the sales and then repurchases go online. So you want to make it a win-win situation for folks. Yes.
By the way, that inside salesperson, that model got commission.
Mhm.
So we actually incentivize them, unlike any other inside salesperson. They actually got commission.
That, I think, is a critical element if you really want to integrate these channels and encourage salespeople to migrate their customers to that more efficient repurchasing and free up their time. So yes, I'm not saying it's necessarily easy to do this, don't get me wrong. So yet another set of studies here. So you guys are all in the know, so I'm not going to go through this, but of course, it's kind of the schematic of a basic primary salesperson buyer interaction from a buyer firm to a seller firm. But what we often don't think about, at least we academics, maybe you guys do, let me know, is there's all these intra-firm interactions that are really important as well on both sides. Decision makers that the boundary person will need to interact with to be able to do certain things, get certain things done for their customer or for their own purpose as a buyer. And of course, the cross-firm person-to-person relationship we're all aware of. But I think what we don't think about as much is how these interplay. We know this structure is here, but we don't think about very much how what goes on between the salesperson and other internal parties can impact what they do and what happens in the interpersonal relationship across firms on both sides. And so what these next couple studies we did was investigating this element to try to look at that interplay. So the first one focuses on the salesperson's role in the relationship. No big surprise. And so one of the things we measured and developed a measure for was what we call seller advocacy, representing the seller's interest to the customer. We didn't want to look at a particular sales strategy, a particular communication, a particular, we just wanted to get a measure of how much does the salesperson put forth in representing their firm's interest? Now, this is what they're hired for, right? It's like, well, duh, that's their job. Agreed. But what does happen is if there's a lot of seller advocacy going on and not much else, the buyer can start to be very suspicious. Are my needs important at all? Are you just trying to meet your quota? Are you just pushing something that you need to get rid of? So is this new product or service you're trying to convince me to buy really in my best interest? So our theory, our hypothesis was a good way to alleviate that kind of suspicion was to look at customer advocacy as well. The extent to which the salesperson represents the customer's interest to the seller. Now, in our context, it's a very specific type, so I'm going to say this. The salespeople in this context had zero flexibility to discount. Zero. They didn't have a range, but if there was a range, you could still extrapolate these findings to what happens when you need to go beyond that range. They had zero. So any potential customer-specific discount had to be approved by the pricing managers, the decision managers inside the firm. Okay, so that's our context. So our basic theory was that when the salesperson engages in more even-handed advocacy, both for the customer as well as for the seller, there would be less suspicion actually on both sides, both on the customer side and on the pricing manager's side. But if the pricing manager didn't think the salesperson was being an effective advocate for the company, they would be suspicious as well and say, wait a minute, have you been co-opted? Do you have a side deal? Are you just, trying to pump, who knows what kind of suspicions could go into play here. So this is what we then wanted to study. Now, again, no one had really measured customer advocacy. There's been a lot of talk in textbooks. Yes, salesperson needs to represent the customer too. But we wanted to really quantify that. So we created a measure of this as well. And what we found was when both happens, the confidence level goes up, you have less suspicion, and things work better. So we engaged in two studies, part of the same basic project here. The first is episodic. It was based on CRM plus pricing and transaction data about specific price discussion episodes. So as I just said, the salesperson had no flexibility on pricing. So we captured from the CRM data any episode in which price was discussed and raised. Typically, of course, it would be raised by the customer. Generally, the salesperson doesn't bring it up. And tracked how many of those happened. Then out of those 13,000+, almost 14,000, we looked how many discount requests came from that customer within a 3-day period. So as you see, most of the time, the salesperson was able to justify, provide an explanation, allay the customer's concerns, but not always. So, little under a third, over a third, still went forth and requested a customer-specific price exception discount. Now, those would then be forwarded to the pricing managers, and as you notice, most were not granted. There was still a relatively small amount that were granted. And so then we wanted to see, well, what happened with customer level profit over the subsequent 3 months? We looked at 1 month, 2 months, 3 months. It's the same, doesn't make a difference. So this was the one study at an episodic level specifically focused on price. We did a second study that was more at the relational level, more general salesperson advocacy. There we had match surveys again from both sides. We surveyed many customers because we wanted to try to get as many matches as we could. 53 salespeople all reported on how much advocacy they engaged in for 5 different customers. That alone is a cool finding because prior to our research, the only way people had even talked about customer advocacy or something similar was as a person level trait. Well, some salespeople advocate, some people are more customer oriented and some people are less customer oriented. No, we were looking at behaviors here. And what we found was a lot of variance across those 5 customers. The salespeople did not advocate in any way whatsoever the same amount for different customers. And we had a stratified sample, so we got a variety of sizes of customers and so forth. So by putting these 2 things together, we ended up with 240 matched customer salesperson dyads. And of those, over a 3-month period, 135 discount requests came from that customer. 49 only got approved, similar ratio to what we saw in the episodic data. And then we again looked at customer level profit. Now, I want to emphasize, in the first study, that was all secondary data. And so we drew the advocacy measures from the CRM reports. In this, we actually directly asked about the advocacy from both sides. So one is at a relational level, one is at an episodic level. It would have to be a pretty strong effect to be found at both levels. That's what we found. And I have to say, we were somewhat surprised. Here's what we thought. We thought, well, you know, the typical model where the salesperson is primarily the advocate for the firm, kind of does a little customer advocacy. We thought that would sort of be maybe kind of the neutral state. And that it would be better when the customer advocacy was higher. That's what we expected. Well, here's what we found. So when seller advocacy is high, but customer advocacy was low, you see by the thickness of the lines, right? Here's what we found. The customer requested more discounts. The seller was less likely to grant the discounts, and the customer's response generated less seller profit after the discount. Less was very less, like it didn't quite go negative, but it was low. We were surprised. We did not expect that. It's like, oh no, the salesperson sort of fulfilling their primary role, and maybe this is not the best configuration after all. So then, on the other hand, when we saw that the salesperson engaged both in a reasonably strong amount of both customer and seller advocacy, what do we find? Well, we find it's a good thing, but it's particularly a good thing when there's one other factor that we also measure comes into play. And that's that they can have some confidence about what's going on outside their view. So in other words, if I'm the customer, I can't see really how they're advocating for me, the salesperson to the pricing managers. I can't see that. If I'm the managers of the firm, I can't necessarily surveil what the salesperson is actually doing in terms of advocating for the firm in their interactions with the customers. So what we found is we really got the effect when there were other mechanisms through which information could flow. So we looked at other customer-seller ties. So in other words, how many other type of interpersonal interactions were there with other aspects? Not necessarily just the buyer, but someone in the firm interacting. Now what's interesting is it's not that they have to actually use those other contacts to check up on what the salesperson's doing. The very fact that there is a mechanism has been shown in previous studies by other people tends to reduce opportunism. Just knowing there's a vehicle and a way that you can be checked up on. So here's what we found. The customer requested fewer discounts, much fewer. Then the seller was more likely to grant a discount when it was requested. And the best, of course, the customer's response generated greater seller profit.
What would be a good connection?
I just want to emphasize that I'll come to you. This wasn't just on the discounted product. We also looked at cross-buying and buying of other products. So there also was an increase in other products as well, more profit from other products. Yes, sir.
What would be an example for the thickening of the blue line? Access to the seller's boss, maybe?
Simply, here again, it was the salesperson reporting on how much advocacy they did. So we basically had a scale, how much do you advocate? So we didn't specify what type, so it could be different types of advocacy, but making the case for this customer, for example. Yes, they're getting real competitive pressures downstream. They need to cut some costs in this particular marketplace. It could be advocating anything, but it's advocating and basically representing the customer inside to those decision makers. So we didn't want to specify certain behaviors. In the CRM study, we had to, search for certain behaviors, and we looked for any way they were essentially making the case for the customer. So this is like, okay, wow, this is a good thing. Advocacy both ways really paid off, and much more strongly in contrast to the baseline normal condition of salesperson represents the firm than we expected even. So it was very enduring. And again, I want to emphasize, this occurred at 2 different levels. This was at an overall relational level study, and it was at this secondary data CRM price episode study. So it's a pretty robust type of effect we found there.
Yeah, it's interesting because the term customer advocacy in, at least in the as a service space, right? So let's take, if you take CRM or any kind of software as a service, is a very common term, but it's on the flip side typically. So
Yeah.
what they're looking at is the customer advocating for the seller? All right, and what we found is very similar findings, and I definitely think there's a kind of dual interaction there, right? Where those who are stronger advocates, their annual renewal rate is higher. Their annual revenue is higher than those who are less advocates. Their profit pool is higher. They're easier, they're cheaper to support.
That's my next study.
Yeah. So it's fascinating, that dual interaction.
Yeah. So no one had looked at dual advocacy. Actually, no one had measured either of these advocacies before at a behavioral type of level like that. So we were very happy. This is something that we're really proud of. I'm hoping it'll be an award-winning article someday. We'll see. So now, going right to what you were talking about, where we also decided, because I told you we're looking at what goes on both firms, we wanted to look at buyer advocacy. Now, you probably were talking when you were inter-organizational.
Yeah, this was a big
Downstream
software company.
advocacy.
Yeah.
This is actually intra-firm, but I think it's the very same type of mentality here, where the buyer and their interactions with the buying group or other decision makers within their firm. We wanted to look at buyer advocacy in this regard. And as we're all aware, if you aren't already doing business with someone, it can be really difficult to even be able to get a chance to pitch to this customer, because so much of the decision process goes on before there's some sort of contact with a salesperson or representative of whatever type of the company. So it's becoming more and more important, we would argue, to have some sort of advocate for you in the company. So we, again, created a measure of buyer advocacy, which tried to measure the buyer's efforts to represent, support, and defend a specific supplier in interactions with buying system colleagues. In this environment, buying systems were the primary internal other party. So just a little, visual here that you have an individual buyer, you got the other people inside the firm that are important, and they're advocating for a specific supplier. Just to give you a sense of what we did measure, when others are looking to source, I will quickly try to recommend the supplier. I'm a supporter. I'm an advocate within my company. If the supplier makes a mistake, I'm quick to defend the supplier to others in my company. Being kind of the champion for this supplier. I'm just going to skip this. This is unnecessary. So here's what we found. We found that buyers' advocacy had an impact. Actually, it had an inverted U impact. But that was moderated by certain things here, particularly in newer and high growth B2B relationships that you didn't turn down quite so much. It was more advocacy did not turn counterproductive. Moderate buyers' advocacy more than doubled purchasing from the advocate supplier compared to low advocacy. But if advocacy was too fervent, oh boy, watch out. It's definitely an inverted U. So high, extremely high buyer's advocacy reduced purchasing substantially. So we had, I don't think I have specific data here. No, I don't. So I'll just tell you about it. This was done in two different contexts. One was this same industrial wholesale type context I've talked about previously. And we got the inverted U. And I was like, you know how hard it is to get an inverted U? We hypothesized and got one, woo. And then we decided that wasn't enough. We needed to do it in another context. So we did it in a context of a security firm. When I say a security firm, we're talking about probably the most diversified security firm on the planet. They provide security for nuclear plants, government facilities, bodyguards, and, you know, your local truck yard. I mean, they have personal, electronic, all sorts of security. And we had a cross section of their customers that we were surveying and checking about the buyer advocacy and such. It was amazing. We got the inverted U in both contexts. So I think, again, it's quite prevalent that having some advocacy is really good, but if it goes too far, then the other decision makers in the company start to think the buyer's been co-opted, is getting a kickback, is no longer objective, whatever. So that sweet spot is something to be pursued, but you don't want to motivate people to go too far. But in certain contexts, again, it's not quite as bad. When it's a newer relationship, the U doesn't really turn over, it just kind of leveled out. Not to say it couldn't turn over, of course, and go back down, but at least in a newer relationship, you didn't get to that point where it could turn negative as soon.
In this study, is it very clearly a kind of one-to-one seller to buyer individual?
No, it had to be the buying group had to approve, but there was one primary contact.
That's what I was
Yes,
asking.
yes. Within this buying group, people were assigned certain accounts, but the decision was made by the buying group. Yeah.
So if you go back to that previous curve, the horizontal axis there, the level of advocacy.
Mhm.
Right, what, you had to cook up some scheme to measure that. I mean,
Well,
tell us.
Yeah, that was the measure I showed a minute ago. This is how we measured it.
Okay. And so this is, you know, the 9s and 10s, but yeah, I got you. Okay, sorry. All right. Because that one, that's a. Okay, thank you. Sorry.
Yeah, so these don't immediately suggest that if I mark high, it's bad. So we got full use of the scale in different contexts, but that's what we wanted. We wanted it not to like be too high is bad signaled by how we measured it. We wanted to try to get an honest report.
That's really.
Yes.
Very, very fascinating, actually. And if you're gonna cover that later on, you can stop me. That is beyond normally the supplier firm's control, how the customer is internally promoting, and I have.
Of course it is, yeah.
So there's a tipping point, and when you have hundreds of customers, you don't know how, you have an idea how the internal advocacy is going on, but any tips or tricks, I mean, how do you know when it tips over?
Well, I think I would want to try to just get a moderate level, not that they're all gung-ho on you, because then I think the suspicion arises. In some of these cases, I think there was a relationship at one time, and then they went and did business elsewhere. And so there was a contact, and so it wasn't totally starting from zero. But I think the biggest problem here is you don't want to have none, and you don't want to have too much. But in all honesty, in different contexts and with different factors, we looked at several factors. The length of the relationship, earlier in the relationship, more advocacy is better. Another thing, if it's a very experienced buyer who already has tons of credibility, and they're much less likely to be somebody who's going to be suspect of being co-opted or somehow nefariously getting kickback or whatever, then it doesn't turn negative nearly as quickly. And sorry, guys, I'm tired. I can't think what the third one was we looked at. There was a third one that also moderated this, but not as strongly as these two. This is why these are the two I wanted to point out, because those were the most important factors we found in delaying the point where it started to become counterproductive. Yes.
This is a little additional to your thinking here, I think, but as a former sales manager, we were managing our salespeople and we call them somebody different. We call them we need to find an internal salesperson.
Yeah.
So somebody in the buyer's company that will sell us internally.
That's what we're talking about, yeah.
We had a whole list of things we could do. Kickback was not even a part of it.
No, I wasn't.
And we had a whole list of things that we would do to create that.
So like what?
Knowledge, empathy, caring, trust, that then equipped that individual to go internally and sell.
Could you give us a couple examples?
Well, as an example, one of the things that we would coach would be, who's your direct boss? And then what does that boss expect from you in terms of
Okay.
MBOs?
So some tactical type of.
Oh, very tactical. It's
Yeah.
all tactical.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, the strategy sounds good, but strategy goes nowhere. unless you have
Right, no,
tactics
so you're
to
talking
back
about
up.
tactical
Yeah.
suggestions.
So we had a whole list of things
Wow.
that the sales, it was sort of a menu of things that the salesperson could feel comfortable with, that hopefully would then cause the buyer to be, if you will, a fan or an internal salesperson.
Yeah.
Now, we didn't use your term.
No, but it's the same.
Yeah.
I think that is exactly how I would go about trying to implement this in practice.
But
We
that
can
was-
think about
was
it that
a
way
long time
because-
ago, too, so that's been around a long time.
Yeah, sometimes the academic literature just sort of completely misses stuff that's really
I'm
important.
talking mid-70s.
I'm not disagreeing. The
Okay.
last time we saw, I mean, very little has been done on the buying side at all in the marketing literature. And we literally had to go back. The only site we could even find about some of this stuff was like back in the 70s. And so we're like, duh, this stuff is really important. We're all looking at the one side of the transaction. What the heck's going on the other side of the transaction? And especially as it gets harder and harder to get a foot in the door. Yes.
Yeah, I think if you look at some industries, other industries, you learn some really interesting insights as to how they're doing this. So you take, let's say the software industry is, I think, pretty advanced as how they do this. So they have customer advocacy organizations and programs, and they incentivize their salespeople to create, customer advocates,
Yeah,
buying
champions,
advocates.
yeah.
So part of that could be, for example, some examples. These are tactical, but these are programs that are extremely resourced and very, very cost heavy to drive advocacy on the buyer side. So one way to tell is, let's put kind of NPS aside, right? Lots of people hate it, lots of people love it, whatever. But for example, so, if you put on, all these software companies put on major conferences, Oracle, every one of these large software companies all have conferences. Can I get the customer to do a case study with me? That's an example. Can I get to speak at my conference? That's an example of advocacy. You take all those things together, you can get a sense for, are they advocating? Or are they just transactional with me, right? Are they just sort of price driven and give me the product, see you later?
And that focuses on the importance of building those
Exactly,
interpersonal
exactly.
relationships.
So they
again.
have people whose job it is to build these relationships. So your research is, I love it. I mean, it's great stuff. And I hope you can start digging into some of these other areas.
I
It's great.
retired recently from the bank, so
So maybe some of your children.
yeah, my children maybe will be digging into this, but yeah, so again, we were at this high level of just trying to get overall customer advocacy. Specifically, we were not looking at what can you do to motivate the customer advocacy. We just wanted to first show the proof of concept that yes, it's very important. Not that you all didn't know this, but again, academic literature, that it's very important to have this. And I think the other important part is be careful that you don't go too far. That I think is a particularly good insight that may not be as well understood, possibly even in practice, as the potential counterproductive in some ways. Did you have a hand up? Okay, sorry. Oh, you did. Okay.
Yeah, we have a different approach. I don't know if this is the norm, but the companies that I've worked for, we rely less on the buyer to be our advocate and hope that they are probably, but we are trying to talk to the
Somebody who's gonna
warehouse
be a
manager,
user
the
or
plant
something.
operator, the,
Could be
you know, and
anybody,
all
right?
those different pieces so that
Yeah.
if the buyer wants to de-source us, the plant manager will say, no, you
Right.
can't do that.
It could be
Like,
somebody
you
who
guys are too
sets the
good.
specs, right? It could be anyone.
Yeah.
In this context, it was just, there was primary buyer contact. But the concept of the internal advocate in your customer, I think generalizes, and you're right. In a particular context, a particular company, a particular industry, you're gonna have different parties. Or maybe you need a multi-pronged approach, right? To be reaching different parties, the engineers on the one side,
That's
maybe
kinda what
at
we do.
engineering conferences where buyers and sellers will both be, and then you need somebody else to be working over on this side. All of those interpersonal ties, as we showed in the previous study, having those helped make the advocacy that went on more effective anyway. And so, yeah, I mean, but my whole point is, yes, we're getting more AI. Yes, we're getting more analytic based, et cetera. But I would not bet on the importance of interpersonal going down too much very soon.
Well, it might even, there was an article, again, I'm not up in the deep literature, it was in Harvard Business Review about a year ago, but when you take this, you take the buying center from the seller side, and now everyone has Google, and now everyone has AI. It's actually making the role of the person salesperson, as a curator, helping people. They came up with a phrase I really love. So the buyers go off into open-ended learning loops.
Yeah.
They're, wow, let's see what else is out there.
Info overload.
And it's slow, it's so, the role that you're pointing to here, the idea that that now actually the more noise there is coming.
To help wade through what's important, what's not
The role
important.
as a curator of a way of, here are things that would be specifically important, for your business.
Mhm.
That's intriguing. The other thing I keep thinking about is the role of brand in this. Is it, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, we did not pull that out separately. I think obviously if you have a super strong brand, then you're going to get a lot easier way to pitch and so forth and so on. But when you're not come to top of mind of maybe two companies, when someone is internally talking about possibilities, then it probably becomes, I would argue, much more important to build even more ties. But I mean, we heard ISBM, IBM thought it was important. I got ISBM, yay. Even
Probably used.
even in that context. So I don't think in this day and age where so much data is available, so much availability to compare and possibly miscompare things, that even market leaders can just, let this go. Because again, the importance of, well, what is important that needs to be considered might not come to the table. Was there somebody? Yes.
I had a question, because in the very beginning, you had the statement around the loyalties to the seller.
Loyalty to the
To
salesperson.
the, to the
Yeah.
salesperson, and that reminds me of, an old chart I had, maybe from Dr. Lebo 20 years ago, is that where the study said it was 55% of loyalties explained through the relationship with the account manager. I think brand was 20%, and I didn't know if you have numbers.
I don't have numbers, because again, we were in a context here where the manufacturer's reps could sell multiple different product lines. Their customers could get the same products from other sources. There wasn't proprietary element. But we were mainly just trying to show, yeah, you can't assume loyalty to the firm is really loyalty to the firm. So that was our goal. But I don't have comparisons. But my biggest message with that is, you should know. You need to find that out in your own context and in your own customers, how, at least approximately, how much is there. Because it has implications in all sorts of ways. It has implications on how badly do I want to hold on to this particular employee? Do I want to do teams so we divide up somehow the loyalty? We did not study that. Honestly, I'm not sure if it's as powerful if there's multiple and not just one main contact. I don't know. We haven't researched that. But I would really want to try to know how much is my firm-owned loyalty out of that portion. Yeah, I own the brand, I have patents, I have these products. How much of my loyalty is really being generated by that, though? I would want to know that if I'm in your shoes. So, as I say, my whole goal is, you can see a whole, like, 20 years of my life, more or less, has been dedicated to looking at these multifaceted ways that interpersonal relationships play a really major role within B2B. And we didn't see in the more recent studies any dimming of that importance. So I think that the death of the interpersonal was kind of overemphasized. Some, salespeople, how many thousand salespeople will be on the street? Well, maybe we won't call them salespeople anymore. Maybe we'll have a different term for them. Maybe they will have somewhat of a different role. But I do not see in the next 10 years that the interpersonal is going to wane greatly. That's my opinion. Thank you all very much for your attention.
One question.
Well, there
about
was
that.
one question in the back.
About
survey.
one question about that, because the way that people of different ages communicate.
Oh, yeah.
What of importance of face-to-face. I'm looking at the kids who are coming up now. We're gonna be in your position, but are they going to actually, they don't want face-to-face communication.
Well, it doesn't have to be face-to-face to be interpersonal.
Well, that's true.
I'm talking about
As long as you can
interpersonal.
talk through a device.
Yeah.
I'm talking about interpersonal.
Snapchat is very personal.
Right, right. So notice I didn't say face-to-face hardly
Yeah,
ever.
I'm sorry.
Yes,
Well, and kind of touching on that a little bit, like, I know we haven't talked as much about blockchain. We've talked a little bit more about like some of the other AI components, but I almost wonder if there's like a level of that interpersonal because of the like transparency level of blockchain that kind of gets at some of that more interpersonal. You're trusting someone to see your entire chain of transactions, where this interpersonal aspect is going to be, I don't know, somehow enveloped within that blockchain. So not getting rid of the interpersonal aspect, but like I only use blockchain with those partners or those suppliers and buyers that I feel I have a strong interpersonal relationship with, because I'm essentially giving them access to everything I'm doing. So like I'm wondering if like some of these things are actually helping one another, like the interpersonal relationships are actually going to also help the transparency and the technology-based systems together. I think that might be something really interesting to look at as well.
I do think that not commenting on blockchain particularly, but the underlying principle that it is those that are able to seamlessly integrate the non-personal electronic other channel type of interfaces with the ability to bring in the interpersonal and have the interpersonal, that those are the ones who I think are going to win in the longer run personally. That's my belief in this regard, and all of my research seems to show that. Even in the one where we did not expect the salespeople to have, the very first one I talked about, or second one, where, you know, it doubled when the big online purchasers had more salesperson contact. We didn't expect to get a 2x on that.
That's a pretty emphatic result.
It was huge, and the firm was absolutely shocked. And we accounted for God knows how many other things. So it's not like, oh yeah, we just looked at 2 things. No, we accounted for size, history, all sorts of, my gosh, I don't know, had 10 control variables or something that accounted for all sorts of other things. So it was huge, for sure. And again, I want to thank you very much for your attention and your questions. I appreciate it.